You've said the phrase harmonic distortion 100 times. You know exactly what it means. The warm hum of a tube preamp, the growl of an overdriven guitar, the color a compressor adds to a vocal that makes it feel alive instead of flat. But the real answer is far stranger than any of that. The phrase you've used 100 times can't even describe half the instruments played on this planet. Here's what almost nobody in a studio stops to ask, even engineers who use the word every single day. Harmonic compared to what? Start with the word itself because it isn't as neutral as it sounds. A harmonic series is a very specific mathematical pattern, a fundamental frequency followed by whole number multiples of itself. Twice the fundamental, 3 times, 4 times, on in a clean, predictable ladder. Your vocal cords produce something close to this pattern when you sing a sustained note. So does a guitar string, a violin string, the air column inside a trumpet. So does a vacuum tube, pushed just past its comfortable operating point, quietly adding those same whole number multiples back into the signal. It's not a coincidence that engineers built an entire vocabulary of warmth and harmonic richness around these objects. It's because these objects happen to obey that specific mathematical rule. But why does a string obey it so obediently in the first place? A string is fixed at both ends, held taut from one point to another with nowhere else to go. That single physical fact forces its vibration into a family of modes that are almost perfectly related by whole numbers, because the boundary conditions leave it very little room to do anything else. The string can vibrate as one long arc or split into 2 shorter arcs or 3 or 4, and each of those patterns corresponds almost exactly to a whole number multiple of the fundamental. Your vocal folds work under similar tension-driven physics, stretched and set into oscillation by airflow, producing a comparable ladder of overtones. A vacuum tube's distortion curve, mathematically, behaves the same way when you push a smooth signal past its limit, generating new energy at clean multiples of whatever frequency you fed it. 3 very different technologies, one shared underlying shape. It's elegant. It's also, without anyone deciding it on purpose, extremely narrow, because it only describes objects that happen to share that particular constraint. Even the Western scale itself was built on top of this same assumption. The octave, the fifth, the fourth, the intervals that feel the most stable and consonant to a Western-trained ear, are all simple ratios drawn directly from that same harmonic ladder, 2-to-1, 3-to-2, 4-to-3. An entire system of tuning grew up around instruments that produced that ladder naturally. It isn't a coincidence that the scale and the instruments reinforced each other for centuries. It's the same physics expressed twice. Now pick up a tubular bell, or better, a solid metal bar, and ask that same instrument to make a sound. It doesn't obey the strings rule at all. A bar vibrating in bending motion, rather than under simple tension, produces overtones that are inharmonic, meaning they don't line up as neat whole number multiples of the fundamental at all. The physicists Neville Fletcher and Thomas Rossing documented this in exhaustive detail in their landmark text, The Physics of Musical Instruments, showing that struck bars, plates, and tubes generate overtone spacings governed by an entirely different set of equations than a plucked string. The math isn't a minor variation on the harmonic series. It's a different family of solutions altogether. So what happens when an entire culture tries to force that different family of vibration into sounding harmonic anyway, whether it wants to or not? You get the modern church bell. Thomas Rossing, working with the physicist Robert Perrin, spent years measuring the actual vibrational modes of bells, publishing detailed acoustic studies on exactly how a bell produces its tone. What they found is remarkable. A bell's natural partials, the hum, the prime, the tierce, the quint, the nominal, are inherently inharmonic on their own. Left untouched, a cast bell simply doesn't ring in tune with itself by any harmonic standard, which is why European bell founders spent centuries developing a slow, painstaking craft, shaving precise rings of metal from the inside of the bell to nudge specific partials into an approximate harmonic relationship. Handbells, which never went through that same centuries-long correction, remain audibly inharmonic to this day, which is part of why massed handbell performances can sound subtly unsettled even when every bell is struck perfectly. Read that again because it's the whole argument in miniature. The natural, honest sound of a bell is inharmonic. What you're hearing in a Western cathedral is not the natural voice of the object. It's centuries of skilled labor, bending a fundamentally inharmonic instrument into agreement with a preference that was never a law of physics to begin with. Bell founders passed this craft down as trade secrets, generation after generation, refining it by ear and by trial long before anyone could measure a partial with an oscilloscope. They were, in effect, quietly correcting an entire category of instrument to fit a musical assumption imported from stringed and vocal music. The bell never asked to sound harmonic. It was made to. That preference has a name, and it isn't neutral either. It's the sound of a specific set of instruments, the ones that happen to dominate European art music. Strings, voices, air columns, and eventually vacuum tubes and transistors built to imitate them. When that tradition needed a word to describe distortion, warmth, and color, it reached for harmonic, because harmonic was the pattern its favorite instruments already produced. There was nothing dishonest about the choice, but there was something quietly exclusionary about it, because an enormous portion of the world's instruments were built on the opposite physics from the very beginning. Consider Indonesian gamelan. Gamelan orchestras are built largely from metallophones, bronze bars and gongs struck to produce sustained, ringing tones. Every one of those bars behaves like the bending metal Fletcher and Rossing described, not like a tension string. Its overtones are naturally inharmonic. For a long time, Western listeners encountering gamelan described its tuning systems, slendro and pelog, as simply out of tune, measured against a harmonic ruler that was never built to measure them. Slendro divides the octave into roughly 5 uneven steps, pelog into 7, and neither maps cleanly onto anything in the Western 12-tone system. That mismatch was routinely treated as a deficiency in the music, rather than a difference in the underlying acoustics generating it. The engineer William Sethers eventually tested that assumption directly. In his research, later published in his book Tuning, Timbre, Spectrum, Scale, he measured the actual inharmonic spectra of real gamelan instruments and calculated where dissonance naturally rises and falls for that specific timbre. The result overturned a century of casual dismissal. Gamelan tunings sit remarkably close to the points of lowest dissonance for their own instrument's actual overtone structure. Retune a gamelan piece into 12-tone equal temperament, the Western default, and by Sethers's own measurements, it becomes measurably more dissonant on those instruments, not less. The tuning wasn't an approximation of something else. It was a precise solution to a physics problem the Western scale was never designed to solve. So the gamelan was never out of tune. The vocabulary judging it was simply missing the physics required to hear it correctly. Once you notice this, it's hard to stop noticing it everywhere. A cymbal is inharmonic. A gong is inharmonic. A xylophone bar, a steel drum, a wood block, a set of tubular chimes hanging in an orchestra pit. All of them are inharmonic by the same bending motion physics that shapes a bell. That's not a small, exotic corner of the world's instruments. That's most of global percussion, an enormous share of the instruments humans have built for thousands of years, sitting almost entirely outside a vocabulary built around strings, voices, and vacuum tubes. And yet walk into any studio, open any plugin folder, and the language doesn't reflect that at all. Harmonic exciters, harmonic saturation, total harmonic distortion, measured as a spec sheet number on nearly every piece of gear you own. Every one of those tools was designed, quite reasonably, around the physics of strings, voices, and tubes, because that's the tradition that built the recording industry. None of it is wrong for what it measures. It's simply incomplete for what it claims to describe, because it was never asked to describe a gong, a gamelan boning, or a cast bronze bell in the first place. Load a spectrum analyzer under a struck steel drum sometime and watch how little of that display resembles the tidy, evenly spaced ladder you'd see under a bowed cello string. The tool isn't broken. It's just being pointed at physics it was never built to read. So here's the smaller, sharper question underneath all of this. What would it even mean to build a harmonic exciter for an inherently inharmonic instrument? Perhaps nothing at all, because the entire concept of a harmonic exciter assumes there's a clean harmonic series worth enhancing in the first place. Apply that logic to a bell or a boning, and you're not enhancing the instrument's real character. You're quietly correcting it toward a different one, the same instinct that sent bell founders scraping metal off the inside of bronze for centuries, just automated and hidden inside a plugin. None of this means the harmonic vocabulary is useless. For strings, for voices, for tubes and transistors, it's precise, it's earned, and it works exactly as intended. The problem was never the physics. The problem is calling it universal, when it was only ever describing one branch of a much larger tree, mistaking a regional dialect for the whole language of sound. A language built almost entirely around the instruments of one continent, exported worldwide as if it were the only grammar sound could possibly follow. So the next time you reach for the words harmonic distortion to describe a texture you're hearing, pause for 1 second and ask what's actually vibrating. A string, a vocal fold, a tube, or a bar, a bell, a gong, a bronze key struck by a mallet, doing something the word harmonic was never built to hold. Which one is it? The answer changes what you're actually allowed to say about the sound, and how much of the world's music your own vocabulary can even reach. You've said the phrase harmonic distortion 100 times, certain you knew exactly what it meant. What it actually meant all along was a single dialect of vibration mistaken for the whole language of sound.